The year was 1847, and England stood at the pinnacle of its imperial glory. Queen Victoria, though only 28 years of age, had already ruled for a decade with an iron will wrapped in velvet gloves. The monarchy represented not merely a crown, but the very soul of an empire upon which the sun never set. Within the marble corridors of Buckingham Palace, where crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across portraits of long-dead kings, secrets lived in the spaces between whispered conversations and carefully guarded silences. The palace itself was a monument to absolute power, its Georgian architecture speaking of permanence and divine right. Vast halls stretched like cathedral naves, their floors polished to mirror perfection, reflecting the carefully orchestrated movements of courtiers who understood that every gesture, every word, every fleeting expression could determine the fate of nations. The very air seemed heavy with protocol, thick with the unspoken rules that govern not just a court, but an entire civilization. Lady Catherine Ashworth moved through these halls with the practiced grace of someone born to navigate such treacherous waters. At 24, she possessed the kind of beauty that stopped conversations, not merely because of her features, which were indeed striking, but because of the intelligence that sparkled behind her emerald eyes. Her auburn hair was arranged in the elaborate style demanded by court fashion, every curl precisely placed, yet there was something untamed about her that no amount of pomade could entirely suppress. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk, its bodice fitted to perfection, the skirts sweeping behind her in rustling waves that seemed to whisper secrets of their own. Catherine served as one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting, a position that granted her unprecedented access to the inner workings of the monarchy while simultaneously binding her with chains of discretion stronger than any metal. She had witnessed royal temperaments, political machinations, and personal struggles that would have made fascinating reading for the scandal sheets, yet her lips remained sealed by an oath as sacred as any religious vow. The Queen's private chambers were a sanctuary within a sanctuary, decorated with an eye toward both comfort and majesty. Heavy damask curtains and rich burgundy-framed windows that looked out upon meticulously maintained gardens where peacocks strutted among perfectly manicured hedgerows. The furniture was an exquisite blend of English craftsmanship and continental elegance, chairs upholstered in the finest Lyonnaise silk, tables inlaid with mother-of-pearl, and everywhere the subtle gleam of gold leaf applied by master artisans who understood that luxury was not about ostentation, but about the perfect marriage of beauty and function. It was in these chambers that Catherine first learned of the letter's existence. She had been arranging correspondence on the Queen's mahogany writing desk when Her Majesty entered, her usual composed demeanor slightly ruffled. Victoria was a small woman, barely 5 feet in height, but she possessed a presence that could fill the largest ballroom. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, revealing a face that, while not conventionally beautiful, radiated an intelligence and determination that commanded immediate respect. "Catherine," the Queen said, her voice carrying the peculiar mixture of authority and uncertainty that Catherine had learned to recognize as a sign of deep concern. "I require your absolute discretion in a matter of the utmost delicacy." The Queen moved to a section of the wall that appeared identical to every other panel, but Catherine watched with growing amazement as Her Majesty pressed a nearly invisible catch, causing a hidden compartment to swing open on silent hinges. Within lay a single envelope, its cream-colored paper yellowed with age, sealed with black wax that bore an impression Catherine could not quite make out in the dim light. "This letter," Victoria continued, lifting the envelope with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly, "was discovered among my late uncle's papers. King William's solicitor found it sealed within a strong box that had been locked for nearly 2 decades. The seal bears the coat of arms of the House of Hanover, and the handwriting." She paused, studying the flowing script on the envelope's face. "The handwriting appears to be that of my grandfather, King George III." Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air seeping through the palace walls. King George III, the monarch who had lost the American colonies, who had suffered from mysterious fits of madness that had required the appointment of his son as Prince Regent. A letter from such a source, hidden away for decades, could contain anything from state secrets to family scandals that might prove more dangerous than any foreign enemy. "Your Majesty," Catherine ventured carefully, "have you considered that perhaps some secrets are best left undisturbed?" Victoria's laugh held no mirth. "My dear Catherine, I am the Queen of England. I cannot afford the luxury of willful ignorance, no matter how tempting it might be. This letter was hidden for a reason, and until I know what that reason was, I cannot sleep peacefully in my bed, knowing that somewhere in my palace lies a document that could potentially threaten everything I have worked to build." The weight of royal responsibility was something Catherine had observed but never fully comprehended until this moment. To wear the crown meant to carry not just the hopes and dreams of a nation, but also the accumulated secrets and sins of every monarch who had come before. Each generation inherited not only titles and treasures, but also the carefully buried mistakes of their predecessors. "Then you intend to break the seal?" Catherine asked, though she already knew the answer. "I must," Victoria replied, settling into her favorite chair, a masterpiece of Chippendale craftsmanship upholstered in green velvet that brought out the color of her eyes. "But I will not do so alone. You will bear witness to whatever truth this letter contains, and you will help me decide how best to address whatever revelations it may bring." Catherine took her position beside the Queen's chair, her heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and dread. In her years of service, she had learned that royal secrets were rarely pleasant ones. They were the kind of truths that required careful handling, diplomatic solutions, and sometimes the kind of sacrifice that demanded everything while offering nothing in return. The Queen's fingers worked carefully at the ancient wax seal, which cracked with an audible snap that seemed to echo through the chamber like a pistol shot. The sound was final, irreversible, the breaking of a barrier that had stood for decades between the present and whatever painful truth lay buried in the past. As Victoria unfolded the letter, Catherine noticed that her own hands were clenched so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. The paper rustled with the dry whisper of age, and even from her position beside the chair, Catherine could see that the ink had faded to a brownish hue that spoke of decades spent in darkness. The Queen's face grew increasingly pale as she read, her eyes moving across the lines of faded text with growing alarm. Finally, she looked up at Catherine, and in her expression, Catherine saw something she had never witnessed before in the 10 years of her service: genuine fear. "Catherine," the Queen whispered, her voice barely audible above the ticking of the ornate clock that stood sentinel in the corner of the room, "we are about to face the greatest crisis this monarchy has seen since the Wars of the Roses." The letter trembled in Queen Victoria's hands as she read its contents aloud, her voice growing weaker with each revelation. The handwriting was unmistakably that of King George III, written during one of his periods of clarity before his final descent into madness. The date at the top of the letter indicated it had been penned in 1810, during the height of the Regency crisis that had seen his son, the future George IV, assume the responsibilities of the crown while the king remained technically sovereign. "My dear William," the letter began, addressing Victoria's predecessor, "I write this during a moment of divine clarity, knowing that the shadows in my mind grow ever darker and that this may be among the final coherent thoughts I am able to commit to paper. There are truths that must be preserved, secrets that could destroy our dynasty if they were to become public knowledge, yet I cannot bear to carry them to my grave without ensuring that future generations might have the wisdom to address what I, in my cowardice and confusion, have left unresolved." Catherine found herself leaning forward despite her better judgment, drawn into the historical drama unfolding before her. The very air in the room seemed to have grown thicker, as if the weight of royal secrets had a physical presence that pressed down upon everything within the chamber. Victoria continued reading, her voice now barely above a whisper, "The matter concerns the legitimacy of our claim to the throne itself. During my father's reign, circumstances arose that called into question the validity of certain marriages within our lineage. Documents were altered, witnesses were silenced, and a lie was told that has grown so large and so pervasive that it has become the foundation upon which our entire dynasty rests. The Queen paused, her eyes scanning ahead before she could bring herself to voice the next revelation. Catherine watched as Her Majesty's composure, so carefully maintained through years of public scrutiny and political crisis, began to show hairline cracks like fine porcelain subjected to unbearable pressure. There was another marriage, Victoria continued, her voice growing stronger as if she had decided that speaking these words quickly would somehow lessen their impact. A secret ceremony that predated the union that history recognizes as legitimate. The bride was a Catholic, which according to the Act of Settlement would have invalidated any claim to the throne by her descendants. However, the marriage produced a son, and that son survived to adulthood, married, and had children of his own. Catherine felt the blood drain from her face as the implications became clear. If such a marriage had indeed taken place and produced legitimate heirs, then the entire Hanoverian succession could be called into question. The current royal family, including Queen Victoria herself, might be nothing more than usurpers who had inherited a crown that rightfully belonged to others. The documents proving this marriage, the letter continued, were thought to have been destroyed in a fire that was deliberately set to eliminate all evidence of the union. However, copies were made and hidden in locations known only to a select few. One such copy was secreted within the foundations of St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, sealed within a lead box and concealed behind a stone that bears a particular marking that would be recognizable to those who know what to seek. Victoria set the letter down on her lap and stared into the dancing flames of the fireplace, as if hoping to find answers in their ever-changing patterns. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled with the magnitude of what they had just learned and the impossibility of unknowing it. "Your Majesty," Catherine finally ventured, her voice carefully controlled despite the chaos of thoughts swirling in her mind, "what does His late Majesty suggest should be done with this information?" Victoria picked up the letter again, her hand steadier now, as if the initial shock had given way to the kind of grim determination that had enabled her to rule an empire while still in her 20s. "He writes that the decision must be left to future generations, to monarchs who might possess the wisdom and strength that he felt he lacked. He suggests that if the rightful heirs can be located and if they prove themselves worthy of the crown, then arrangements might be made for a peaceful transition that would spare the nation the trauma of a succession crisis." "And if they prove unworthy?" Catherine asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Then the secret should be buried forever, and those who possess this knowledge should carry it to their graves rather than risk the destruction of the monarchy and the chaos that would surely follow." Victoria folded the letter carefully and held it against her chest as if it were both a treasure and a curse. "However, King George also warns that others may possess knowledge of this secret, and that as long as the truth remains hidden, the monarchy will remain vulnerable to blackmail and manipulation by those who might use such information for their own purposes." Catherine moved to the window, gazing out at the gardens where gardeners went about their daily tasks, blissfully unaware that the world they knew might be about to change forever. The perfectly manicured lawns and precisely trimmed hedgerows seemed to mock the chaos that had just been unleashed within the palace walls. Everything appeared normal, peaceful, eternal, yet beneath the surface, the very foundations of the kingdom were shifting like sand. "We must find out if this other branch of the family still exists," Victoria said, her voice taking on the decisive tone that Catherine recognized as the Queen's way of wresting control back from circumstances that threatened to overwhelm her. "If there are legitimate heirs living in obscurity, unaware of their birthright, then we have an obligation to locate them and assess their claim." "And if we find them?" Catherine asked, turning back from the window. "What then? Do we simply hand over the crown and hope that the nation accepts such a dramatic change without descending into civil war?" Victoria stood and began pacing, her silk skirts rustling with each step, the sound filling the chamber like the whisper of autumn leaves. That, my dear Catherine, is precisely the question that will keep me awake for many nights to come. But first, we must determine whether this thread is real or merely the fevered imagination of a monarch whose grip on reality was already tenuous when he penned these words. She moved to her writing desk and began composing a letter, her quill scratching across the paper with quick, decisive strokes. I am writing to the Dean of Windsor Castle, requesting a private audience to discuss some historical research I wish to conduct in St. George's Chapel. We will pose as scholars interested in the architectural features of the chapel's foundation stones. Catherine watched as the Queen worked, admiring despite everything the calm efficiency with which Her Majesty could shift from crisis to action. It was this quality, perhaps more than any noble bloodline, that truly qualified Victoria to wear the crown. The ability to face the impossible and immediately begin planning how to achieve it. You realize, Catherine said carefully, that if we discover proof of this alternate succession, you will be faced with the most difficult decision any monarch has ever had to make. Do you sacrifice your own claim to the throne for the sake of legitimacy, or do you protect the stability of the kingdom by maintaining what may be a lie? Victoria paused in her writing and looked up at Catherine with eyes that seemed to have aged years in the span of minutes. I realize that I may have just learned something that will require me to choose between my duty as a queen and my obligations as a woman of conscience. I pray that God will grant me the wisdom to choose correctly, because the wrong decision could destroy not just my reign, but the very concept of monarchy in England. The letter was sealed with the royal signet, the red wax bearing the impression of the crown that might not rightfully belong to the woman who wore it. Catherine took the letter, understanding that she was now irrevocably bound to whatever course of action the Queen had chosen. There would be no stepping back from this precipice, no pretending that the knowledge they now possessed could be forgotten or ignored. As evening settled over London, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold that rivaled the richest tapestries in the palace, Catherine prepared for a journey that would either confirm the legitimacy of the current royal line or expose a deception that had shaped the destiny of nations for generations. Windsor Castle stood against the autumn sky like a stone monument to the eternal nature of English monarchy, its towers and battlements having witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, the celebrations of victories, and the mourning of defeats that had shaped the character of a nation. As Queen Victoria's carriage approached the castle gates, Catherine could not help but feel that they were embarking upon a journey that might reveal truths capable of bringing down everything those ancient walls had been built to protect. The Dean of Windsor, Dr. Edmund Thornfield, was a man whose entire bearing spoke of scholarly devotion and unshakable discretion. Tall and lean, with silver hair that caught the light filtering through the chapel's stained glass windows, he possessed the kind of face that inspired confidence, lined by years of study and contemplation, yet animated by an intelligence that missed very little. He had served the royal family for nearly 3 decades, and his loyalty was beyond question, making him the perfect ally for the delicate investigation they were about to undertake. Your Majesty, Dr. Thornfield said, bowing deeply as Victoria entered St. George's Chapel, Catherine following close behind. I confess myself intrigued by your request to examine the foundational stones of the chapel. Such architectural details are rarely of interest to members of the royal family, though of course, I am delighted to assist in any scholarly endeavor you might wish to pursue. Victoria had chosen to present their mission as historical research, claiming an interest in the construction techniques employed by medieval craftsmen. It was a plausible enough explanation, and one that would allow them to examine the foundations without arousing suspicion among the chapel staff or the castle's other inhabitants. The chapel itself was a masterpiece of Gothic architecture, its soaring arches and intricate stone tracery creating an atmosphere of profound reverence. Light streamed through windows that told the stories of saints and kings in brilliant colored glass, casting rainbow patterns across floors that had been worn smooth by centuries of royal footsteps. The very air seemed heavy with history, thick with the accumulated prayers and ceremonies that had sanctified this space for generations. The foundations date primarily to the 14th century, Dr. Thornfield explained as he led them toward the altar, his voice echoing softly in the vast space. However, there have been numerous additions and modifications over the centuries. King Henry VIII made substantial changes during his reign, and there were further renovations under the Stuarts and again during your grandfather's time. Catherine felt her pulse quicken at the mention of King George III renovations. According to the letter, the hidden documents had been placed during that very period, concealed behind a stone bearing a particular marking that would be recognizable to those who knew what to seek. They descended into the crypt beneath the chapel, where the temperature dropped noticeably and the air carried the musty scent of age and stone. Here, among the tombs of long-dead royals, the foundations of the chapel were clearly visible, massive blocks of limestone that had been cut and fitted with such precision that even after centuries, the joints between them remained nearly invisible. The markings you see here, Dr. Thornfield said, running his hand along a series of symbols carved into one of the foundation stones, are mason's marks, used by the craftsmen to identify their work and ensure proper payment. Each stonemason had his own unique symbol, passed down through guild traditions that date back to Roman times. Victoria and Catherine exchanged glances as they began their search, looking for anything that might match the description provided in King George III letter. The light from their lanterns cast dancing shadows across the stone surfaces, making every carved line and weathered edge seem to shift and change, as if the very walls were alive with secrets waiting to be discovered. It was Catherine who first noticed the anomaly, a stone near the eastern corner of the crypt that bore not the geometric symbols typical of mason's marks, but rather what appeared to be a crude representation of a crown surmounted by a cross. The carving was skillfully executed despite its simplicity, and something about its placement seemed deliberately conspicuous to eyes that knew what to seek. Dr. Thornfield, Victoria said, keeping her voice carefully neutral, this particular stone seems to bear a marking different from the others. Do you have any knowledge of its significance? The dean moved closer, adjusting his spectacles to examine the carved symbol more carefully. How curious, he murmured. I confess I have never noticed this particular marking before, though I have walked these crypts countless times over the years. The crown and cross motif is certainly unusual for a mason's mark. It appears almost heraldic in nature. Victoria caught Catherine's eye and nodded almost imperceptibly. This had to be the stone described in the letter, the one behind which King George III had concealed the evidence of the secret marriage that could invalidate the entire Hanoverian succession. Would it be possible, the Queen asked with studied casualness, to examine the stone more closely? Perhaps there are additional markings that might shed light on its origins and purpose. Dr. Thornfield looked momentarily puzzled by the request, but his devotion to scholarly inquiry overcame any doubts he might have harbored about the unusual nature of their investigation. Certainly, Your Majesty. We have tools available for such purposes, though I should warn you that any examination of the chapel's structure must be conducted with the utmost care to preserve the integrity of these ancient foundations. As the dean went to retrieve the necessary equipment, Victoria and Catherine found themselves alone in the crypt, surrounded by the tombs of monarchs whose reigns had helped shape the England they knew. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant sound of wind moving through the chapel above and the soft drip of moisture somewhere in the shadows beyond their lantern light. Are you certain you wish to proceed? Catherine asked quietly. Once we examine this stone, there will be no returning to ignorance. Whatever we find will become knowledge that must be acted upon. Victoria stood before the marked stone, her hand resting on its surface as if she could divine its secrets through touch alone. I have spent my entire reign attempting to be worthy of the crown I inherited, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. If that crown was never rightfully mine to begin with, then I owe it to England and to the rightful heirs to discover the truth, no matter how painful it might prove to be. Dr. Thornfield returned with a selection of tools suitable for examining stonework without causing damage. Under his expert guidance, they carefully probed the edges of the marked stone, discovering that it was not, as they had initially assumed, an integral part of the foundation wall, but rather a fitted piece that could be removed without compromising the structural integrity of the surrounding masonry. The work was delicate and time-consuming, requiring them to proceed with archaeological precision to avoid any damage that might reveal the true purpose of their investigation to future observers. As they worked, Catherine found herself thinking about the implications of what they were doing. If they discovered the documents described in King George III's letter, they would be faced with a choice that no monarch in English history had ever been forced to make. Finally, after nearly 2 hours of careful work, the stone shifted. Behind it lay a cavity that had been sealed for decades, within which rested a lead box bearing the royal arms. The box was small enough to be lifted by one person, yet Catherine felt as though they were moving something with the weight of kingdoms. Dr. Thornfield stared at the box in amazement, clearly beginning to understand that their scholarly research had uncovered something far more significant than architectural curiosities. "Your Majesty," he said slowly, "I believe we have discovered something that was deliberately hidden. Perhaps we should consider carefully how we proceed from this point." Victoria lifted the box from its hiding place, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what they had found. "Dr. Thornfield, I am about to share with you a secret that could change the very nature of English monarchy. What we have discovered today may force us all to re-examine everything we thought we knew about the legitimacy of the crown itself." As they carefully replaced the stone to conceal evidence of their investigation, Catherine realized that they had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. Whatever documents lay within that lead box would either confirm the legitimacy of Victoria's reign or expose a deception that had endured for generations. The weight of that knowledge, and the responsibility for deciding how to use it, now rested squarely upon their shoulders. The return journey to Buckingham Palace passed in contemplative silence, each of them lost in thoughts of what the evening might reveal and how the discovery would reshape not just their own lives, but the destiny of an entire nation. The Queen's private study had been transformed into something resembling a clandestine meeting room, with heavy curtains drawn against the evening light and only the warm glow of oil lamps to illuminate the momentous task before them. Victoria, Catherine, and Dr. Thornfield sat around the mahogany desk upon which the lead box rested like an accusation, its presence seeming to charge the very air with possibility and dread. Dr. Thornfield had been sworn to absolute secrecy regarding their discovery, though Victoria suspected that a man of his intelligence and discretion had already deduced the general nature of what they had uncovered. His scholarly excitement was tempered by obvious concern about the implications of whatever documents lay within the box that had been hidden for so many decades. The box itself bore the unmistakable craftsmanship of royal artisans, its lead surface decorated with the intricate heraldic symbols that had marked the reign of King George III. A small brass plate affixed to the lid bore an inscription in Latin, Veritas Temporis Filia, truth is the daughter of time. The irony of that motto, given their current circumstances, was not lost on any of them. Victoria's hands trembled only slightly as she worked to open the ancient locks that had kept the box sealed. The mechanisms were stiff with age and corrosion, requiring Dr. Thornfield's assistance to finally release the catches that had guarded their secrets for so long. When the lid finally opened, it revealed a collection of documents wrapped in oiled silk that had protected them from the ravages of time and moisture. The first document that Victoria withdrew was clearly a marriage certificate, written in the formal Latin that had been customary for such records in the late 18th century. Even Catherine, whose knowledge of Latin was limited, could make out enough words to understand that they were looking at evidence of a union between Prince Frederick Augustus, Duke of York and Albany, and Lady Maria Fitzherbert, described in the document as a devout daughter of the Holy Roman Church. "This cannot be," Dr. Thornfield whispered, his scholarly composure finally cracking as he read over the Queen's shoulder. "The Duke of York was never married to Mrs. Fitzherbert. That marriage was conducted with the Prince of Wales, the future George IV, and even that union was considered legally invalid due to the Royal Marriages Act and Mrs. Fitzherbert's Catholic faith." Victoria continued reading, her face growing increasingly pale as the implications became clear. "This document suggests that there were two separate marriages to Catholic women within the royal family. The Duke of York's marriage to Lady Maria Fitzherbert predated his brother's more famous union with the same woman by several months. According to this certificate, Lady Maria was pregnant at the time of her marriage to the Duke of York." Catherine felt the room spinning around her as she grasped the full significance of what they had discovered. If the Duke of York had indeed married a Catholic woman in a ceremony that predated his brother's marriage to the same woman, and if that marriage had produced legitimate children, then the succession established by the Act of Settlement would have been violated from the very beginning of the Hanoverian line. The second document was even more damaging, a baptismal record showing that Lady Maria had indeed given birth to a son, Frederick George Augustus Fitzherbert, who had been secretly baptized in the Catholic faith and raised in obscurity under the protection of sympathetic noble families. The child's existence had been concealed to protect both him and the royal family from the scandal that would have erupted if the truth had become known. "There is more," Victoria said, her voice barely audible as she unfolded a third document. "This appears to be a genealogical record tracing the descendants of Frederick George Augustus Fitzherbert through several generations. According to this, the legitimate male line continued unbroken, and there are currently living descendants who would, under a strict interpretation of primogeniture, possess a stronger claim to the throne than our own family." Dr. Thornfield sank into his chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had discovered. "Your Majesty, if these documents are authentic, then the entire succession that brought your family to the throne was based upon the concealment of a prior, legitimate claim. The implications for the stability of the monarchy, indeed for the entire structure of English government, are beyond calculation." Catherine moved to pour brandy for all three of them, recognizing that they would need something to steady their nerves as they contemplated the choices that lay before them. The amber liquid caught the lamplight like liquid gold, a reminder of the wealth and power that hung in the balance as they decided how to proceed. "We must determine whether these descendants still exist," Victoria said, her voice growing stronger as she began to channel her shock into purposeful action. "If they do, we need to learn about their circumstances, their character, their fitness to rule. A bloodline alone does not make a monarch, there must also be the wisdom, strength, and dedication necessary to serve a nation." "And if we find them wanting?" Catherine asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Then we must decide whether to reveal the truth despite their unsuitability, or to maintain the current succession while knowing that it rests upon a foundation of deception." Victoria stood and began pacing, her silk skirts rustling with each step. "Either choice carries enormous risks. If we expose the truth and elevate unworthy claimants to the throne, we could plunge England into chaos. If we conceal the truth and continue to rule under false pretenses, we leave ourselves vulnerable to blackmail and manipulation by anyone else who might possess this knowledge." Dr. Thornfield cleared his throat carefully. "Your Majesty, there is another consideration that we have not yet discussed. These documents have been hidden for decades, yet King George III's letter suggested that others might possess knowledge of this secret. If that is true, then our discovery of these papers might not be the end of this affair, but merely the beginning." The implications of his words settled over them like a shroud. If other copies of these documents existed, if other people possessed knowledge of the secret succession, then Victoria's throne was already in jeopardy whether she chose to act upon this information or not. The only question was whether she would control the revelation of the truth or whether it would be forced upon her by others who might use it for their own purposes. "We need to conduct a thorough investigation," Victoria decided. "I want to know everything about the current descendants of this hidden line. Their names, their occupations, their political affiliations, their personal character. I want to know if they are aware of their heritage, and if so, whether they have any intention of pressing their claim." Catherine realized that they were embarking upon a course of action that would require the utmost secrecy and delicacy. They would need to investigate living people who had no idea they were being watched, to make judgments about individuals who might be perfectly content with their current lives and would never choose to claim a throne that could destroy their peace and privacy. "There is something else," Victoria said quietly, returning to the documents. "According to this genealogy, the current heir to this alternate succession is a woman. Lady Elizabeth Fitzherbert Ashford, aged 26, currently residing in the county of Yorkshire under circumstances that suggest her family has fallen upon reduced financial circumstances." The irony was not lost on any of them. If these documents were genuine, then the rightful Queen of England was living in obscurity in the countryside, possibly struggling with the same kinds of financial difficulties that plagued any number of genteel families who had seen their fortunes diminish over the generations. "We must go to Yorkshire," Victoria said, her decision made. "We must see this woman for ourselves, assess her character and capabilities, and determine whether she represents a threat to the stability of the kingdom or an opportunity to correct an historical injustice." As they carefully repackaged the documents and returned them to their lead box, Catherine couldn't help but wonder whether they were preserving evidence of the greatest secret in English history or preparing to unleash forces that would destroy everything they had sworn to protect. The only certainty was that their lives, and the life of their nation, would never be the same. The journey to Yorkshire unfolded through landscapes painted in the amber and crimson hues of late autumn, as Queen Victoria travelled incognito under the guise of Lady Margaret Thornfield, supposedly the wife of a prosperous merchant conducting business in the northern counties. Catherine accompanied her as her companion, while Dr. Thornfield remained in London to maintain the fiction that the Queen was occupied with routine royal duties. The elaborate deception was necessary to ensure that their investigation of Lady Elizabeth Fitzherbert Ashford could be conducted without arousing suspicion or creating the kind of public spectacle that would inevitably follow any official royal progress. Their destination was Thornfield Manor, a once grand estate that had seen better days, its Georgian facade showing the subtle signs of genteel decline that marked so many noble families who had been unable to adapt to the economic changes reshaping England. The manor sat amid rolling hills dotted with sheep, its parkland still beautifully maintained despite obvious limitations in resources. Ancient oak trees lined the drive, their bare branches creating intricate patterns against the grey November sky. As their carriage approached the manor house, Victoria felt her heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Somewhere within those walls lived a woman who might possess a stronger claim to the English throne than Victoria herself. The woman they had come to observe was, according to the genealogical records, the great-great-granddaughter of Frederick George Augustus Fitzherbert, the secret son whose very existence challenged the legitimacy of the Hanoverian succession. Lady Elizabeth Ashford proved to be a woman of remarkable presence, though her circumstances bore clear evidence of reduced fortune. At 26, she possessed a natural elegance that no amount of financial difficulty could diminish. Her dark hair was arranged simply but tastefully, and her dress, while clearly not of the latest fashion, was immaculately maintained and worn with the kind of unconscious grace that spoke of excellent breeding. Most striking were her eyes, a deep blue that seemed to hold depths of intelligence and strength that reminded Victoria uncomfortably of her own reflection. The cover story that had gained them admission to the manor was Victoria's supposed interest in purchasing artwork from families seeking to liquidate assets to meet financial obligations. It was a plausible enough explanation for their presence, and one that allowed them to observe Lady Elizabeth in her natural environment while ostensibly conducting business negotiations. I confess that parting with family portraits is not a decision we have made lightly, Lady Elizabeth said as she led them through the Manor's picture gallery, her voice carrying the refined accents of excellent education despite her circumstances. However, practicality must sometimes override sentiment, and we have determined that these particular pieces might find more appreciative homes with collectors who can properly care for them. Victoria found herself studying Lady Elizabeth with the intensity of someone whose entire world might be about to change. Everything about the woman suggested noble breeding, her posture, her speech, her unconscious assumption of authority even while discussing the sale of family treasures. There was something regal about her bearing that seemed to come from within rather than from external circumstances. The manor itself told the story of a family that had once enjoyed considerable prosperity but had gradually been forced to economize without losing their essential dignity. The furniture was of excellent quality but showed signs of careful maintenance rather than replacement. The carpets were beautiful but worn, and the paintings on the walls bore the unmistakable marks of old masters, yet Lady Elizabeth was considering their sale to meet financial obligations. "Your family has lived here for many generations?" Catherine asked, carefully probing for information about Lady Elizabeth's background and heritage. "Indeed," Lady Elizabeth replied, pausing before a portrait of a distinguished gentleman in 18th-century dress. "This is my great-great-grandfather, Frederick Ashford, who acquired the estate through marriage in the 1790s. The family history is quite interesting, though perhaps not remarkable by the standards of Yorkshire nobility. We have always been connected to various branches of the aristocracy, though never at the very center of political power." Victoria exchanged a meaningful glance with Catherine. The dates matched perfectly with the information contained in the hidden genealogy, and the name Frederick could easily be explained as a family tradition honoring the secret royal ancestor whose existence had been concealed for generations. As they continued their tour of the manor, Victoria found herself increasingly impressed by Lady Elizabeth's intelligence and character. The woman displayed a thorough knowledge of art, literature, and current affairs that would have been appropriate in any drawing room in London. More importantly, she showed a genuine concern for her tenants and staff, discussing their welfare with the kind of informed compassion that marked a natural leader. "The agricultural depression has affected everyone in this region," Lady Elizabeth explained as they paused near a window overlooking the estate's farmlands. "We have been forced to reduce rents for our tenant farmers, which has naturally impacted our own income. However, I believe that a landlord's first obligation is to the people who work the land, not to maintaining a lifestyle that the land can no longer support." The philosophy she expressed was remarkably similar to Victoria's own beliefs about the relationship between privilege and responsibility. Here was a woman who understood that noble birth carried obligations as well as advantages, who was willing to sacrifice personal comfort for the welfare of those who depended upon her leadership. During luncheon, Victoria had the opportunity to observe Lady Elizabeth in conversation with her elderly father, Lord William Ashford, whose frail health had left much of the estate's management in his daughter's capable hands. The affection and respect between father and daughter was evident, but so was Lady Elizabeth's natural assumption of authority and her skill in managing both practical affairs and family relationships. "Elizabeth has been a blessing to this family," Lord William said, his voice weak but filled with pride. "She has maintained our standards and our dignity even when circumstances have required us to make difficult choices. I sometimes think she would have made an excellent queen, if fate had placed her in different circumstances." The innocent comment struck Victoria like a physical blow. Here was a man who had no knowledge of his daughter's true heritage, yet he instinctively recognized in her the qualities that made for effective leadership. The irony was almost unbearable. As the afternoon progressed, Victoria found herself facing the most difficult decision of her reign. Lady Elizabeth Ashford was clearly intelligent, principled, and capable of inspiring loyalty and respect. She possessed the kind of natural authority that could not be taught or acquired, only inherited along with the blood that carried the right to rule. If the documents they had discovered were genuine, then this woman was not merely a claimant to the throne, she was, by right of birth and primogeniture, the true Queen of England. The weight of that realization settled upon Victoria like a crushing burden. Everything she had worked to achieve, every decision she had made in the name of serving her people, had been based upon a lie so fundamental that it challenged the very concept of legitimate monarchy. Yet to reveal the truth would not only destroy her own reign, but could plunge the nation into a succession crisis that might end parliamentary monarchy altogether. "Lady Margaret," Lady Elizabeth said, using Victoria's assumed name, "you seem troubled. I hope our discussions today have not been disappointing." Victoria looked into those intelligent blue eyes and realized that she was looking at a woman who possessed every quality necessary to be a great queen, yet who had been denied that opportunity by an historical conspiracy that had elevated the wrong family to the throne. The knowledge was almost unbearable, yet it was knowledge that she alone possessed the power to act upon. "Not disappointing," Victoria replied carefully, "merely illuminating in ways I had not expected." As their visit concluded and they prepared to return to London, Victoria knew that she faced the greatest crisis of conscience any monarch had ever been forced to endure. The choice before her was not simply between truth and deception, but between justice and stability, between her personal honor and her duty to the nation she had sworn to serve. The carriage ride back to London passed in contemplative silence, each mile carrying them further from the woman who might be the rightful Queen of England and closer to a decision that would determine the fate of the monarchy itself. The private audience chamber at Buckingham Palace had never felt more oppressive as Queen Victoria sat across from Catherine and Dr. Thornfield, the weight of their discovery hanging between them like an accusation that demanded resolution. 3 weeks had passed since their return from Yorkshire, 3 weeks during which Victoria had barely slept as she wrestled with the implications of what they had learned about Lady Elizabeth Ashford and her legitimate claim to the throne. The documents from the hidden cache lay spread across the mahogany table between them, each piece of evidence a testament to a deception that had shaped the destiny of nations for over half a century. Additional research conducted by Dr. Thornfield had only served to confirm the authenticity of the papers and the accuracy of the genealogical records that traced the true royal line through generations of enforced obscurity. "I have spent considerable time examining these documents from every possible angle," Dr. Thornfield reported, his scholarly objectivity barely concealing his personal anguish over the situation. "The handwriting, the paper, the ink, the seals, everything confirms that these are genuine historical records from the period in question. More importantly, I have been able to verify several details through independent sources that corroborate the timeline and circumstances described in these papers." Victoria nodded grimly. She had expected no less, though a part of her had hoped that closer examination might reveal the documents to be clever forgeries that would allow her to dismiss the entire affair as an elaborate hoax. Instead, each day had brought fresh confirmation that the woman they had met in Yorkshire was indeed the rightful Queen of England according to the laws of primogeniture and legitimate succession. "What troubles me most," Victoria said, her voice carefully controlled despite the emotional turmoil that had plagued her for weeks, "is not merely that Lady Elizabeth possesses a stronger legal claim to the throne, but that she also possesses the character and capabilities that would make her an excellent monarch. This is not a case of choosing between legitimacy and competence. We are faced with the realization that justice and practical wisdom point in the same direction." Catherine had spent the intervening weeks conducting her own investigation into Lady Elizabeth's background, using the network of contacts that her position at court provided. What she had learned only reinforced their initial impressions of a woman whose natural leadership abilities and moral character made her supremely qualified for the responsibilities of monarchy. "The reports I have received from Yorkshire paint a picture of a woman who commands universal respect and affection," Catherine reported. "Her tenants speak of her fairness and compassion, her neighbors praise her intelligence and judgment, and even the local clergy hold her in the highest regard for her charitable works and moral character. If we were seeking to identify the ideal candidate for the throne based purely on merit, Lady Elizabeth Ashford would undoubtedly be among the first names considered. The irony was not lost on any of them. Here was a woman who possessed both the legal right to rule and the personal qualities that would make her an exceptional monarch, yet revealing the truth of her heritage would necessarily destroy the stability that the current royal system provided. The choice before them was not between right and wrong, but between two different interpretations of duty that seemed impossible to reconcile. There is another consideration that we have not yet fully addressed, Dr. Thornfield said carefully. During my research, I discovered evidence that suggests we are not the only ones who possess knowledge of this secret succession. There are references in various historical documents to rumors and whispers about the true heritage of the Ashford family. If such knowledge exists elsewhere, then our choice may not be whether to reveal the truth, but whether to control the circumstances under which it becomes public. Victoria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November weather seeping through the palace walls. The possibility that others might possess this knowledge and could use it to manipulate or destroy the monarchy had been lurking at the edges of her consciousness for weeks. If hostile forces gained access to evidence of the legitimate succession, they could use it to foment revolution or foreign intervention that would be far more damaging than a controlled transition of power. What do you suggest? Victoria asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. I believe we must approach Lady Elizabeth directly, Dr. Thornfield replied. We must reveal the truth of her heritage and gauge her response. If she proves to be a woman of integrity who places the welfare of the nation above personal ambition, then perhaps we can work together to find a solution that serves justice without destroying stability. The suggestion terrified Victoria even as it appealed to her sense of justice. To approach Lady Elizabeth would be to acknowledge the legitimacy of her claim and to invite a conversation that could lead to the end of Victoria's own reign. Yet the alternative, to continue ruling while knowing that she occupied a throne that rightfully belonged to another, seemed equally impossible. And if Lady Elizabeth chooses to press her claim? Catherine asked. If she demands immediate recognition of her rights and refuses to consider the broader implications for the stability of the kingdom? Then we will face the crisis that we have been trying to avoid, Victoria replied with grim determination. But at least we will face it on our own terms, with full knowledge of the facts and with the opportunity to manage the transition in a way that minimizes damage to the nation. The decision, once made, brought with it a strange sense of relief mixed with terror. Victoria had spent her entire reign attempting to be worthy of the crown she wore, to serve her people with dedication and wisdom that would justify the trust they had placed in her. If that crown rightfully belonged to another, then her greatest service to the nation might be to ensure that it reached its proper owner in a manner that preserved the institution of monarchy while correcting an historical injustice. A letter was composed that evening, written in Victoria's own hand and sealed with the royal signet that might soon pass to other hands. In it, she requested a private meeting with Lady Elizabeth Ashford on a matter of the utmost importance to both their families. The letter was deliberately vague, providing no hint of the earth-shaking revelations that would be shared during their meeting, yet it carried enough authority to ensure that the request would not be ignored. As the letter was dispatched by special courier to Yorkshire, Victoria found herself contemplating the possibility that she might be arranging her own abdication. The thought should have filled her with despair, yet instead she felt a curious lightness, as if the burden of carrying an illegitimate crown was heavier than the prospect of losing it in service to justice and truth. Whatever happens, Victoria said to Catherine as they watched the courier's carriage disappear into the London fog, we will meet this crisis with integrity. If I must surrender the throne, I will do so knowing that I have served England's interests rather than my own, and that the crown will pass to someone who has earned it through character as well as birthright. The waiting began then, a period of suspended animation during which the very foundations of English monarchy hung in the balance. Within days, a response would arrive from Yorkshire, and the course of history would be determined by the character and wisdom of a woman who had lived her entire life unaware that she was the true Queen of England. As winter settled over London, Queen Victoria prepared to face the greatest test of her reign, not a war with foreign enemies or a crisis of parliamentary confidence, but a reckoning with truth itself and the question of whether justice could be served without destroying the very institutions that had made England great. The crown upon her head had never felt heavier, yet she wore it with a dignity that would define her legacy regardless of whether she kept it or passed it to more deserving hands. The letter that would change everything was already on its way north, carrying with it the power to reshape a kingdom and the hope that truth, however painful, might ultimately prove stronger than the lies that had shaped a dynasty. In the end, Victoria realized, the measure of a true monarch was not the legitimacy of their claim to power, but the wisdom and courage they showed in wielding it, even if that wisdom demanded the ultimate sacrifice of surrendering the crown itself. The story of the hidden letter had reached its culmination, but the greater story of how England would emerge from the revelation of its greatest royal secret was only beginning. Whatever the future held, it would be shaped by the choices made in the crucible of this moment, when the weight of crowns proved lighter than the weight of conscience, and when the true meaning of royal duty was revealed in the willingness to place justice above personal interest, truth above convenience, and the welfare of the nation above the preservation of any single dynasty's hold on power.